Glory to Jesus Christ. This is Father Jack Custer at St. Michael's Cathedral in Passaic, New Jersey, back with session 6 of our series based on the book Come and See. We've been looking at the general question of why you might want to belong to a church and what's the difference among the churches out there. We've been working our way slowly toward a definition of what it takes to be called an authentic apostolic community that can trace its origins back to Jesus Christ. On page 17, we looked at this a couple of sessions ago. The book Come and See lays out some similarities and differences between Byzantine Catholics and Roman Catholics. Excuse me. And there's a whole column of things that are called notable differences: the use of icons, the way we make the sign of the cross, our liturgical calendar, the ordination of married men, the way Holy Communion is received and by whom it's received, the orientation of the liturgy where everybody faces east, the presence of an icon screen separating the holy place, the altar, from where the people are, the custom of standing as a general rule for liturgical services, the strong reliance on the texts of the first 1,000 years of Christianity, the fathers of the church, and the theological notion that our liturgy, our worship, participates and mirrors, images the eternal liturgy in heaven. Those are some of the things that distinguish Byzantine Catholicism from Roman Catholicism. Imagine there was another page that said liturgical similarities and differences between Byzantine Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians. The list would be the Pope and the authority structure, period. In every other respect, the Byzantine Catholic Church is in fact effectively the same as the various Eastern Orthodox churches. And it's true for us, and it's true for Eastern Orthodoxy, that we tend to identify our churches with an ethnic label: Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Byzantine Slav Catholic, Ukrainian Catholic, Melkite, Arab Greek Catholic, and so on. The similarities are so great that very often people will look at us and say, "Oh, you're an Orthodox church. You don't look very Catholic." Because when I think of Catholic, I think of the Mass, I think of the Rosary, I think of an organ, I think of ashes on Ash Wednesday, I think of clean-shaven priests who are not married, and you guys are none of those things. Let's do a bit of history and figure out how all this happened. We've already talked about how the church took on the local culture of various places. And the Eastern Orthodox churches sprang up pretty much everywhere except in the region under the influence of Rome. Not exclusively. And for the rest of this session, I need to ignore the various other Eastern Christian communities that are not of the Byzantine tradition. So the East and West Syrians, the Armenians, the Chaldeans, the Copts, the Ethiopians, and the South Indians. We're only talking about the Byzantine world here. For most of the first 1,000 years of Christianity, after the Emperor Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to the newly founded city of Constantinople, Byzantium, in the early 4th century, It was the Eastern world, the Greek-speaking world, that dominated economically, dominated culturally, dominated politically, dominated militarily. The West was in a bit of a shambles. And these centuries are known, in fact, as the Dark Ages in Western European history. As a matter of fact, the first 7 ecumenical councils, where the entire Christian church gathered to discuss matters of doctrine and practice, were all held in the East, either in Constantinople or in nearby cities like Nicaea and Chalcedon and Ephesus, all of which are to be found today in Western Turkey. It's really only with the rise of Charlemagne and a new empire in the West in the year 800 that the Western Latin-speaking church and the political situation in Western Europe begins to grow in strength and dominance again. Up until then, while the Western Church functioned quite happily in Latin and continued to send missionaries north into Scandinavia, west as far as Ireland, Iceland, and England, south into Spain and even North Africa. There was a lively Latin-speaking church in North Africa, the Church of St. Augustine, for example. And the Eastern Greek-speaking Church of Byzantium continued to extend missionaries all over the Eastern world. There was an area of tension, and it's the area we know as Central and Eastern Europe. There were both Latin Christian missionaries and Byzantine Christian missionaries meeting up with each other in places that would now be the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia. This, plus some political tension between the new Western Empire of Charlemagne and the Eastern Roman Empire, because they still called themselves the Roman Empire, even though the capital was in Byzantium, began to create some hard feelings that expressed themselves in religion. Under the influence of Charlemagne, the Roman Church added to the creed, the statement of faith that's proclaimed at every liturgy and is especially important for baptism, added a word that was not originally in the creed as established by the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea and Constantinople. The whole church agreed on the creed in 325 and 381. Charlemagne in the 800s insists on inserting this new word into the creed. In English, it's 2 words, insisting that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. We're not going to get into the theology of that. The problem was that the Western segment of the church, the Latin-speaking church, had presumed to change a document of an ecumenical council that the entire church had agreed upon and had been using for 500 years. This, plus some disagreements about whether it's proper to use leavened or unleavened bread in the Eucharist, arguments over authority, especially about who has authority over the church in southern Italy, in Sicily, in Calabria, in Puglia, where there had been a Greek-speaking population since well before the Christian era. This created a temporary separation between the Latin and the Greek-speaking church. The issue was resolved, but it was obvious that there was ill will and that some folks were just looking for a fight. Things began to boil up again in the first decades of the new millennium. And in 1054, almost by accident, as a kind of outburst of anger, the Pope's ambassador to Constantinople, Cardinal Humbert, and the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, mutually excommunicated each other, which is to say, they said to each other, "You and I no longer belong to the same church. You may not receive Holy Communion in my church, and I sure wouldn't receive Holy Communion in yours." This was dramatic, and it was as much over political questions as over the unresolved dogmatic questions about the extra words in the creed, or what kind of bread to use in the liturgy, or who has authority over which pieces of territory. And things only got worse in the following centuries with the Crusades, as large armies of Latin, Western, Catholic Christians began invading historically Eastern territory, ostensibly to defend the holy places from desecration by the newly powerful Islamic forces in the East, but along the way, doing a fair amount of damage to Greek-speaking Eastern churches, and eventually establishing rival bishops in places that had been Eastern Greek patriarchates for centuries: Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria. A situation that endured until the Second Vatican Council, by the way. Attempts were made to patch the two churches together. There was a council held in Lyon in France in 1272, another council held in Ferrara and Florence in Italy in 1439. In both cases, the Byzantine representatives were under immense pressure from a gradually encroaching Islamic army. The Ottoman Turks are slowly moving west and just gobbling up chunks of Christian territory. They need military support from the West. And so they come to these councils in a position of real inferiority. And because of this imbalance in the councils, whatever decisions were reached were never really accepted, and the churches remained divided. The fall of the city of Constantinople to Mehmed the Conqueror, the Ottoman Sultan, in 1543, I believe is the date. I'm drawing a blank. Really sealed the deal. East and West were now going to be separated. The Eastern Greek Church cut off and in a weakened position under a Muslim domination, while the West continued to grow in strength and in culture and began to feel more and more superior to this impoverished and unfree Eastern Greek Church. Likewise, the discovery of the New World opened up to the Latin-speaking Catholic Church a whole new area of missionary activity: North and South America, Africa, India, China, areas that were no longer open to the Greek-speaking Orthodox Church. From 1054 onward, it's customary to speak of the Western Church as the Catholic Church and the Greek Eastern Church as the Orthodox Church. Although, in fact, the word Catholic, as we saw, means universal and applies to all of those churches. And the word Orthodox means worshiping correctly, believing correctly, and equally applies to all of those churches. The situation of the Byzantine Orthodox churches didn't get any better. As the Ottoman Empire gradually became more and more sickly and corrupt. The Russian Empire began to gain dominance, and within the Russian Empire, the Orthodox Church became essentially an arm of the state. In the Austrian Empire, later the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the dual monarchy, that came to rule all of Central Europe, that had an Eastern Christian population, countries like what's now Slovakia, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Western Ukraine. There too, religion was an arm of the state, and the religion was Roman Catholicism. So those who belonged to an Eastern church were second-class citizens. Eventually, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Orthodoxy became illegal, and Eastern Christians were absorbed under the name Greek Catholics. We'll say more about that in a minute. These same areas fell under the unfortunate rule of communism for between 75 and 50 years in the 20th century. These areas were the crossroads of both world wars. These areas are still struggling with the effects of post-communism, radical Islam, and the churches in these areas, in the Middle East and Central and Eastern Europe, continue to be limited and complicated by the political situation around them. A bit of good news. In 1965, Pope Paul VI, the head of Roman Catholicism, and the ecumenical patriarch Athenagoras of Constantinople met. The first time the two heads of those churches had met in centuries. And they removed that statement of excommunication from each other. They undid the damage that had been done in 1054 on a personal level. Ever since then, there have been ongoing dialogues between Catholic and Orthodox theologians, regular visits between Catholic and Orthodox ambassadors. Everyone recognizes that as long as the Catholic and Orthodox churches remain separate, what Jesus Christ prayed for at the Last Supper in John chapter 17, that all might be one, we're not fulfilling the Lord's command. We all know this division is wrong, but there is so much politics, geography, centuries of ill will, and a fair amount of ignorance that makes it difficult to take positive steps toward actual reunion of these two churches, which can each claim to be descended from the apostles, to be Catholic, that is to say, universal in their outreach, can both claim to profess the one faith, can both claim to be endowed with the charism of holiness and the ability to sanctify people, but are separated ultimately over the issue of authority. The particular church to which St. Michael's Cathedral belongs, the particular church of the Byzantine Eparchy of Passaic, the church that put out this book, the church that's inviting you to consider whether you might want to be part of us. We have a particular history, and it's a happy history, because exactly when that first separation was happening between Latins and Greeks in the late 800s, two brothers were sent as missionaries from Constantinople to Central Europe at the invitation of the Prince of Greater Moravia, Rastislav. They were sent by Patriarch Photius of Constantinople, the very patriarch who temporarily broke communion with the Church of Rome. Saints Cyril and Methodius, there's a nice picture of them on page 55 of the book, two brothers from Thessalonica, who somehow, we often say because of their mother, who somehow knew a Slavic language. Thessalonica is very close to Bulgaria. Somehow they knew a Slavic language, and they were sent to be missionaries in Greater Moravia, the area that's now the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Western Ukraine, Southern Poland, Northeastern Hungary. And they did what Byzantine missionaries do. They brought the faith in the language of the people. St. Cyril invented an alphabet so that for the first time, the Slavonic language could be written down, and by writing it down, they could translate the Holy Gospels, the Psalms, the liturgy. We don't know exactly how many of the church books were translated in their lifetime, but certainly within a generation, the entire library of Orthodox Christian literature was available in the Slavonic language. And this caused a problem because there were German missionaries in the same area. And they were leading people to the faith, but celebrating the services in Latin, reading the gospel in Latin. And you can imagine that for all sorts of reasons, the local population was very attracted to missionaries who could speak to them in their own language and allowed them to worship in their own language and recognized good things in their culture and used them to advantage. And so Cyril and Methodius were hauled off to Rome in the year 868 to answer to the Holy Father for this strange thing they were doing. And they successfully defended their mission. Missionaries from Constantinople now arguing before the Pope of Rome for the validity of bringing Catholicism in its Byzantine form, in the Slavonic language, to the people of Central Europe. And Pope Hadrian II blessed this mission, and they went back. Cyril died in Rome on that visit. Methodius goes back to Greater Moravia and continues his mission as a bishop. He was ordained by the Holy Father. And he's hauled back to Rome again in 878 after spending some time in a monastic prison. The Latin missionaries do not like what he's doing, and they keep trying to put a stop to this Slavonic Byzantine thing. This time before Pope John VIII, St. Methodius successfully defends the mission to the Slavs. And so my church, the Byzantine Slav Catholic Church, was from the very beginning a church that was both Byzantine in its origin and in all of the elements of its tradition, yet entirely in communion with the Church of Rome, at a time when there was some question about whether Byzantines and Romans should be in communion with each other. My church began as a church of union. Now, in 1054, when the East and Western churches, the Catholic and Orthodox churches, definitively split, it took some time for that split to trickle down to all of the places where Eastern Christians were living. But certainly that division, which is sometimes called a schism, that division eventually reached Central and Eastern Europe. And for several centuries, these people who had been brought to Christianity by Cyril and Methodius found themselves in the Orthodox world. Their bishops came from the Greek-speaking Orthodox world. In the 1500s, a whole new problem emerged in the West. It was the agitation of the so-called Protestant Reformation, and Protestant preachers from Germany and Switzerland were quickly making the short trip to Central and Eastern Europe. Many of the nobility in Central and Eastern Europe, in fact, became Calvinist, Reformed, or Lutherans. And in the custom of the time, would very often impose their religion on the indentured servants, the serfs that worked their lands. And these Eastern Christian, now Orthodox people, found themselves kind of defenseless. Their priests were not terribly well trained. In come these smart preachers who know their Bible inside out, and these people felt defenseless. The clergy felt defenseless. The bishops felt defenseless in the face of this sort of agitation. And so, in 1598, in Western Ukraine, and again in 1646 in the Transcarpathian region of what's now Ukraine, and again in the 1700s in other places, groups of Eastern Orthodox Slav Christians came back into voluntary union with the Holy Father in Rome. These unions of formerly Orthodox people who had been formerly undivided Christians, traditionally Byzantine, but loyal to the Pope of Rome. These people now voluntarily came back into union with the Church of Rome. And with that came civil rights, with that came a better seminary system, with that came the publication of books, with that came all sorts of immediate tangible benefits. And under the Empress Maria Theresia of Austria, our people acquired a new name. For the first time, what we're going to call these people, she invented the term Greek Catholic. If you're Irish, if you're Polish, you call yourself a Roman Catholic, but you're not Italian. You have nothing to do with Rome except for the Pope. Just as you are Roman Catholic, so our people, even though they have nothing to do with Greece, are called Greek Catholics because the source of our tradition is the Greek-speaking world, just as the source of the religious tradition of an Irish or a German or a Polish or Lithuanian person is Rome, even though none of those people are ethnically Italian. Greek Catholics, that's what our folks have been called since the late 1700s. And in the 1880s and 1890s, these people start to emigrate to the New World in search of a better life, enticed by the money to be made in mills and factories, enticed in some cases by this notion that in America you're free. Lots of Greek Catholics and Roman Catholics from the same areas emigrate to places like Passaic, New Jersey. Once here, for the first time in their lives, they find that their religion is not dominated by the government. They discover that churches are free to organize and incorporate. Our people established our churches before there were priests in many cases. Groups of faithful would gather together, pool their money, buy a building, build a church, and then go looking in Europe for a priest and a cantor to lead the services and teach the children. However, like every immigrant, these people said, oh, we're just going to come to America for a while, make our money, and then go back. And so the European governments they left were very concerned about them. And so both Tsarist Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were sending ambassadors, spies, money, influence to try and keep these people loyal to the governments they wanted them to remain loyal to. But already in Europe, there were some Greek Catholics who realized that their history lay in the Orthodox Church, and even though it was illegal for them to do so in the Austrian Empire, they were attracted to Orthodoxy in its Russian form. And here in the New World, some groups of Greek Catholics decided, we don't need a bishop at all. We'll just build our own independent church. This is America. We can be free here. Here at St. Michael's, there was real tension about whether or not we should give the deed to our beautiful church to the Roman Catholic Bishop of Newark, New Jersey, because we didn't have a bishop in 1890 when this church was established. Our first bishop came in 1907. And for reasons like this, these immigrant communities began to split. And from this Greek Catholic immigration, various Russian and eventually Ukrainian Orthodox churches were founded. So very often in the very same neighborhood where there's a Byzantine Catholic church, there's one or two Orthodox churches across the street, down the street, on the next corner. That's true from where I'm sitting right here in Passaic. So that once again, for totally worldly reasons of politics, sometimes of personality, a division has been made in Christ's church. There was a second division in the Greek Catholic Church in the 1930s over the issue of priestly celibacy, because part of the price of us choosing to be a Catholic church in communion with Rome is that we were always kind of, as the minority, under the overbearing influence of the Latin majority. And there was always this pressure to make us look more like them. And here in America, the Roman Catholic Church decided very quickly that maybe you have married priests in Europe, but you're not going to have them here. And the Holy Father in Rome was convinced to forbid the ordination of married men in the United States for Greek Catholic churches from 1929, a situation that was not rectified until 1990, thank God. And so at a second split in the 1930s, more and more of our Greek Catholic people founded new Orthodox churches. I gotta summarize here. I've just given you a complicated history of human division based on politics and economics and just human pride sometimes. At this point, everybody recognizes that Jesus Christ founded one church, and politics, economics, language, circumstances has moved human beings to allow that church to be split. The primary issue remains the question of authority. What is the authority that Jesus gave uniquely to St. Peter, which passes on to every member, to every successor of Peter as Bishop of Rome? If that question could be resolved, and sometimes folks say, well, let's return to the situation that existed for the first 1,000 years. Let's return to the situation that St. Cyril and Methodius believed. How do you turn back 1,000 years of history? If we could solve that question of authority, the other theological questions that people mention that seem to divide Catholics from Orthodox would be resolved. Questions like the purity of Mary, what Roman Catholics call the Immaculate Conception, the various possibilities for the soul after death, what Roman Catholics call purgatory, exactly what this extra word in the creed means, that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and of the Son. These issues could be resolved if we resolved the basic issue of the authority of the Pope of Rome. As it stands, both the Catholic and Orthodox churches enjoy participation in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of Jesus Christ. Both have valid bishops, both have valid sacraments, both are true churches in every sense of the word. We differ only on the question of the authority of the Pope of Rome. The church I belong to believes it's possible to live the way St. Cyril and Methodius lived, to be authentically Byzantine, to derive our entire theological and liturgical and spiritual life from the rich source of the Greek Eastern tradition, while remaining loyal and while remaining actively part of the Catholic Church under the authority of the Pope of Rome. The church I belong to, the church I'm inviting you to, is a church that struggles above all, to try to maintain that tenuous unity which history has made it so very hard for Christ's church to maintain. We owe it to St. Cyril and Methodius to give it our best shot. That's the church Come and See would like you to come and see. Go with God.